Most people today can tell you their exact age without thinking. Some can even remember the precise hour they were born. Birthdays are written on documents, stored in databases, celebrated every year with candles and numbers that mark time with almost surgical precision. But if you were born in medieval Europe, there is a very high chance that you would not know how old you were. Not approximately, not roughly, simply not know. And this isn't because medieval people were ignorant or careless. It's because, for them, age did not work the way we assume it does. In fact, the very idea of knowing your exact age would have seemed strange, unnecessary, and in many cases, completely meaningless. So why did medieval people rarely know their own age? And what did they use instead to measure a life? To understand this, we need to start with a simple assumption most of us make without realizing it. We believe that age is a number tied to a specific moment in time, the day you were born. But that assumption only works in a world where time itself is stable, standardized, and carefully recorded. Medieval Europe was none of those things. Time was fluid. Dates were negotiable. Years did not always begin in January. Days were defined by sunlight, not numbers. And for the vast majority of people, no one was keeping records of births at all. For most medieval Europeans, life unfolded according to rhythms rather than calendars. The rising and setting of the sun mattered more than dates. The changing seasons mattered more than years. A person's life was measured in harvests survived, winters endured, and rulers who came and went. If you were born to a peasant family, your arrival into the world was not marked with a written record, a certificate, or even a precise memory. It was remembered as something like the summer the wheat failed, or the year after the great storm, or when the old king was still alive. These references made perfect sense to people living within that world, but they did not translate into numbers that could be counted forward with accuracy. Now, you might assume that the church, with its obsession over order and ritual, would have solved this problem. After all, monasteries tracked feast days, saints' days, and complex liturgical calendars. Surely they would have recorded births, right? Well, not exactly. The medieval church cared deeply about when someone was baptized, not when they were born. Baptism was the spiritual entry into Christian life. Birth, by comparison, was just biology. If a record existed at all, it was far more likely to note the day a child was baptized, which could be days, weeks, or even months after birth, especially in rural areas. And even then, those records were not meant to help someone calculate their age decades later. They were administrative tools, not personal milestones. A priest might note that a child was baptized on the feast of St. Martin or 2 days before Easter. References that were meaningful at the time, but incredibly difficult to convert into a fixed date centuries later. This alone would make age tracking unreliable, but the problem went much deeper. In medieval Europe, the year itself was unstable. In some places, the new year began on January 1st. In others, it began on March 25th, the feast of the Annunciation. In still other regions, it began at Easter, a date that moved every year. This means that someone born in what we would call February 1380 might officially be born in 1379, depending on where they lived and which system was being used. Even worse, if you moved from one city to another, Your birth year might suddenly change without anything about you actually changing at all. Now, imagine trying to keep track of your age in a world like that. Each year does not tick over cleanly. It slides, shifts, and sometimes overlaps with itself. And this assumes that you even know the year you were born in the first place, which most people did not. Instead of counting years from birth, medieval people often counted years through reigns. You were born in the 5th year of King Henry's rule, or during the reign of the old emperor, or shortly before the war began. As rulers changed, so did the way time was remembered. This system worked surprisingly well for daily life. If you needed to know whether someone was old enough to work, marry, or inherit property, an exact number was rarely required. Communities operated on social recognition rather than documentation. People knew who was a child, who was grown, and who was old through observation, not calculation. Age was something you embodied, not something you measured. And this brings us to an uncomfortable realization. Knowing your exact age only matters in a society that demands precision from individuals. Medieval society did not. What mattered was function. Could you work the fields? Could you bear arms? Could you marry? Could you produce heirs? These transitions did not happen at fixed numerical ages. They happened when the body and the community decided it was time. Even among the aristocracy, where records were more common, age was still a flexible concept. Noble births were more likely to be documented, but even then, discrepancies were common. Chroniclers often contradicted one another. Dates were recorded using different systems, and ages were sometimes adjusted intentionally for political reasons. A young heir might be declared older to legitimize authority, or younger to extend a regency. Age was not just information, it was a tool. This flexibility extended into legal life as well. Medieval law often referred to stages of life, rather than exact ages. Terms like infant, youth, and of full age mattered more than numbers. The threshold for responsibility or inheritance could vary depending on local custom, circumstance, and social status. A peasant child might be considered an adult far earlier than a noble child, simply because labor was required for survival. Now pause for a moment and consider what this means psychologically. Imagine growing up without ever counting your life in years. No annual reminder of time passing. No birthdays marking progress or decline. Your sense of self would be anchored in roles and experiences, not numbers. You would not think of yourself as 30 or 40. You would think of yourself as a parent, a worker, a widow, a veteran, a survivor of the famine. Time would be something you lived through, not something you measured against. This is where the idea of age begins to dissolve entirely. For medieval people, time was not a straight line moving forward at a constant speed. It was cyclical. Seasons returned. Feast days repeated. Life events followed familiar patterns. In that context, counting years from birth made little sense. What mattered was where you stood within the cycle. Even the tools required to measure age accurately were missing. Mechanical clocks were rare, imprecise, and largely irrelevant to rural life. Minutes did not exist as a meaningful unit of time. Hours changed length depending on the season. If the very length of a day could stretch and shrink, what did a year really represent on a personal level? At this point, it might sound like medieval people simply didn't care about age. But that's not quite true. They cared about age in ways that mattered to their world. Old age carried authority. Youth carried potential. Childhood carried vulnerability. These categories were deeply understood, even without numbers attached to them. And yet, this system created confusion even at the time. Medieval writers occasionally comment on the difficulty of knowing how old someone was. Chroniclers sometimes list multiple ages for the same person. Saints' lives exaggerate ages to emphasize holiness. Kings are described as ruling from youth to old age, without any clear indication of how long that actually was. The further back we look, the worse the problem becomes. Historians today often struggle to determine the birth years of even the most powerful medieval figures. If scholars armed with records, cross-references, and modern methods cannot always pin these dates down, what chance did an ordinary medieval person have? Now here is the turning point. This entire system only begins to collapse when society itself begins to change. As states grow stronger, taxes more precise, and laws more standardized, age starts to matter in new ways. Military service, legal responsibility, education, and bureaucracy all demand numbers. The rise of parish records, especially after the late medieval period, begins to fix births more reliably in time. Age slowly transforms from a vague life stage into a precise data point. But for most of the Middle Ages, this transformation had not yet happened. People lived and died without ever knowing how many years they had existed. And remarkably, society functioned just fine. In fact, one could argue that the obsession with exact age is not a sign of progress, but of control. To know your age is to be placed within a system that tracks, categorizes, and regulates your life. Medieval people escaped that in ways we no longer do. So the next time you see a medieval painting depicting a child who looks strangely adult, or an old man whose age is impossible to guess, remember that the artist likely didn't know either. Age was not hidden. It simply wasn't counted. And now, I want to hear from you. If you lived in a world without birthdays, without age numbers, and without constant reminders of time passing, do you think life would feel longer or shorter? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this journey into the strange logic of the medieval mind, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss future episodes. Medieval life was confusing, uncomfortable, and often brutal, but understanding it might just change how you see your own time.